The Misty Mountains, in terms of a region of Middle-earth, could, in generous terms, be considered contested between numerous different factions, but in terms of the one which claims the vast majority of it, and indeed takes it as their name, the Orcs of the Misty Mountains sit among even the Orcish factions as a very large and ravenous horde set to descend upon their enemies. And in terms of the lore, I mean, it's always a little bit interesting when you talk about these satellite Orcish factions, because their own sense of society is perhaps a little bit more poorly defined than the more civilized groups within Middle-earth. But the Misty Mountains sit in and amongst many different factions, really, as a bit of a thorn in their side, both on the western side of the mountain range from which they take their name, but perhaps even more so to those from the east, considering the incoming dwarven influence trying to reclaim some of the holds that the goblins currently occupy. And indeed, you know, the elves are also close by on both sides of the Misty Mountains, many kingdoms of men, but they're not completely surrounded and beset on all sides by enemies either, with the Witch King and his cronies just to the northwest. They can depend upon some allies, and also at some point in time in the near future they will have the Hill of Sorcery as well, that they can call upon to be their allies in a pinch, especially against the elves on that eastern side of the mountain range. But without further ado, let's talk about some of what the Misty Mountains do well and some of what perhaps they don't do quite so well. The first point is really quite obvious. They have very large armies. More numbers than even their fellow orcs will tend to field, and this gives them a very big battlefield presence in terms of the sheer amount that they can field. And most of this, of course, is going to come from their lower tier goblin infantry units. But even when you start to get into some of their mid to upper tier units, they're still going to place that emphasis on their numbers. For example, even in their bodyguard units, they tend to be more in terms of numbers than many other factions in the game. So even in these areas where the changes are maybe a little bit more minor, they still place the emphasis on having those additional numbers. And indeed, having the numbers advantage is a big part of playing as the Misty Mountains. You want to overwhelm your foes with that horde mentality, like I said, because if you don't, obviously we'll get on to some of the things they don't do quite so well in just a moment. But needless to say, those numbers, while it is a big strength of yours, it is also something that you are incredibly reliant upon if you are to be successful with this faction. But most people who pick the Misty Mountains know exactly what they're getting into when they decide to play as the goblins, so it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. And cost obviously is also a big part of what makes the Misty Mountains able to field these large armies, because these units, individually speaking, are large and relatively cheap. So pretty much the inverse of what you would see when you're playing as one of the elven factions, for example, like Mirkwood, which we talked about last time. However, the Misty Mountains are not completely devoid of quality when it comes to their units, and in particular they do actually have quite a few damaging units, both in melee and at range. Speaking about the units in melee, I mean, most of the units, once you ascend from the very low tier units that you do have access to, many of them place that emphasis on being a little bit more damaging, which, when you consider how many of them there are per unit, this does mean that even though their damage values might not be as high as a faction, obviously, like the elves and the dwarves, who they will be coming into contact with pretty readily on most occasions, the fact that this is multiplied by having more men in the unit does mean that you have that force multiplier working for you. So depending on the exact shape of the engagement that you're going into, in spite of the fact that the numbers may not be quite as high, even in these damage dealing stakes where they do place a little bit more emphasis, having those numbers may actually be more worthwhile in several situations. And this can be especially useful when you're on the attack in a siege, for example, where any faction is going to take casualties, but the Misty Mountains are pretty much inbuilt to take these casualties, even in these more damaging units, which, for other factions you have to kind of safeguard and baby a little bit more. With the Misty Mountains, that isn't necessarily the case. You can send them forward, they are going to take heavy losses, but they're kind of designed to do that whilst dishing out this damage. And this is also true at range, and perhaps more importantly, some of their sort of closer range supporting skirmishers. The crossbows spring to mind in particular, and we'll get onto those when we talk about the units individually on the grassy plain. But these are the kind of supporting units which, if you can pin the enemy in place, you can really start to increase that numbers advantage that you have. And doing damage quickly is an important part of that, because if you do get bogged down in a ground war and it starts to become a little bit more about individual quality, you can be in a little bit of trouble. So making sure that you deploy this damage effectively is important. And finally, monstrous units. The Misty Mountains have a healthy selection of this kind of thing. They have a couple of options when it comes to trolls in melee, a more numerous unit and a more elite unit, although individually speaking, they do have the weakest trolls in the game, but again, they have more numbers of them, so again, dipping into those numbers like we said. But they also have the drakes as well, which are kind of a unique cavalry unit, which are designed around, really high mass. They're kind of similar to a chariot unit in many respects, but they kind of work in their own kind of way, and if you can keep them moving, they can be an incredibly effective unit. Again, we'll speak about each of these examples of units individually when we're actually on the field looking at their units on a one-to-one basis. But making use of these monstrous units and claiming the momentum with them can be an incredibly important thing, because the damage that comes with them is obviously significantly higher than many of your other units can manage. But then if you follow through with all of those numbers, it can really cause a bit of a hole for your opponent, which they will struggle to dig their way out of unless they're prepared appropriately for it. And that is part of the charm of playing as the Misty Mountains is, the opposition can panic when they see just how significant those odds actually are. But it should go without saying, really, that the Misty Mountains have got a fairly obvious set of weaknesses which stem directly, really, from their strengths. The first being poor individual quality. Across the board, really, if you compare each type of unit to what you're likely to get from other factions, on a one-to-one basis, you're going to be coming up short in most of those situations. Even among their fellow orcs, their entry-level infantry unit is not going to be quite as good. They do have a few examples of units which maybe are better and more efficient, even on a one-to-one basis, than some of their fellow orcish factions like the Moria Spearguard and the Whiter Oak Fearmongers, but these are the exception rather than the rule. When you look across the board, really, it is that numbers mentality that they're rolling with, and as soon as it becomes an even fight, generally speaking, that's going to be a bad thing for the Misty Mountains as a result of this slightly lower level of individual quality that they do have to work with. So that is worth bearing in mind. The numbers are, both a blessing and a curse depending upon how well the initial engagements go for you, because if you get put on the receiving end of a bit of a beatdown, it's going to come down to a bit of a quality game late on, and that is not where the Misty Mountains excel by any means, and so you need to be on the lookout for that. Speaking of which, the second thing that we would be, warning you about, I suppose, would be poor morale. The Misty Mountains, even among the orcish factions, again, as a result of depending more on these lower tier units that are based around numbers, it's not necessarily a case of having all of your units killed, which is the problem. It's the case that if you don't have any morale boosting units nearby, or if the engagement starts to go very, very poorly for you, and the enemy is using morale sapping units like poison or fire arrows, for example, or shock units, your units are going to break very, very quickly. And that means that even a relatively healthy unit of goblins, sometimes 150 plus, can end up turning tail and running. And that is not ideal for you, because again, that's going to sap your numbers as well. Maintaining that numbers advantage is all important, and morale breaks are one of the most efficient ways for your opposition to try and lower your numbers quickly. So looking after your morale, making sure your engagements are covered on the flanks, and making sure you have the morale boosting units that the Misty Mountains do have available to them nearby is key. They do have a few units which don't suffer from this, but again, they're much more the exception rather than the rule. And finally, which is something which pretty much all of the orcish factions outside of Mordor do share with one another, they've got poor archers. Their long range support is not ideal. They do have some good options closer up, but longer range, and even when it comes to their artillery, which is an area where Isengard in particular can kind of make up for their lack of quality archers, the Misty Mountains artillery is useful for certain things, but it isn't really a long range skirmishing dominator, really. It's more for specialised things, which we'll talk about when we actually speak about it on the grassy plain, but long range is not where the Misty Mountains excel, and it's not where you should be keeping the engagement to for any length of time, really. You want to be closing up with the enemy, at least getting your mid-range skirmishers in view, and hopefully forcing a melee engagement as quickly as you can, because the longer it stays at arm's length, the more damage you're going to be taking. You're going to be on the wrong end of most of those engagements, and again, it's all about maintaining that numbers advantage rather than allowing your opposition to sap it, regardless of what situation you're in, whether you're on the defence in a siege, on the attack, or whether it's a more even fight on the open field. And speaking of open fields, we will be heading over to the grassy plain now to take a look at what the Misty Mountains have on a one-to-one basis. So even here, when we're just viewing the units in this fashion, you do get a sense of appreciation for the scale of what the Misty Mountains armies can be when you have a full composition. And here I have cheated a little bit and cut out one of the armour upgrades for one of the basic infantry units, purely because if I did leave it out, then it would have just been the artillery all on its own in the second part of the video, kind of an awkward sized roster from that point of view. But many of the armour upgrades consist of giving the Misty Mountains that sort of slightly tatty but Balrog inspired rough plate that they tend to traffic in, and we will see an example of that right from the off here as we get to work on their basic infantry. But you can see there is a bit more of a focus around their infantry and their trolls here, at least in terms of variety of units, with a slightly lesser focus on basic archers and such, and cavalry a little bit more so again with a unique artillery piece. So an interesting distribution of units, but with the infantry, and in particular the numbers of infantry that you're going to be fielding, that is going to be the key here. And we start off with the most basic of such, which is the standard goblin infantry. And with a recruitment cost of only 100, it's really only the orc fodder that they can be compared to in terms of sheer cheapness of units, and there are a few other of the evil men factions that come close but not quite matching the sheer bargain basement prices that you're looking at when it comes to the goblin infantry. However, the cost can go up just a little bit when you upgrade the armour by 2 levels here. You get a sort of interim as well, but when you have the upgraded armour it does increase all the way up to 6, which, even though you do increase the cost of the unit, and it's actually a significant increase when you consider the percentage of the baseline cost, it is worthwhile because obviously you're spreading out those armour upgrades across 253 units, which is a lot, and even then they're still cheap. So to make each of them as survivable as you can is going to pay dividends for you in the long run if you can afford it. But generally speaking, the Misty Mountains, it's not going to be too difficult to play that sort of game of money Tetris that you often have to when it comes to building an army composition, because of the amount of more affordable units that you do have to work with as the Misty Mountains. But when you have a look at these stats, obviously they're nothing to write home about. The attack of 4, even though they're not subject to the spear malus, is still pretty low, and obviously the fact they don't have a spear also means that they're not going to have a bonus against cavalry, so there's no easy value to be gained there. Though they can hide anywhere, which can be useful. I mean, it's not going to be a devastating ambush when it comes to this level of unit by any means, but still it's nice to have, better to have it than not. And the defense, this is skewed a little bit by the fact the armor has been increased a bit. Shield, again, considering it's a very cheap unit, you can't expect the very best, but it will serve its purpose. Lower defensive skill again, but this is more to plug holes in your roster where you have them for a relatively cheap outlay, and of course really hammering home that numbers advantage that you do have as the Misty Mountains and will have over most other opposition. But when it comes to building a front line which is maybe a little bit more sturdy in some respects, then the Moria Halberdiers, something which they do share in common with Mordor and Angmar. Both of them also have a unit of basic halberds as well. Only 400 is possibly the cheapest that you can pay for a phalanx unit in the game, but this does come with obvious downsides as well. The phalanx, the bonus fighting cavalry, and the effectiveness against armour is something that all halberdiers share. An attack of 6 is, again, relatively low, but that is armour piercing, and for a cheaper unit of halberdiers it's perfectly serviceable considering the level of value you can get out of them if the formation stays intact. But it's in the defence where you do start to see, you know, oftentimes with phalanx units you have to take the stats with a pinch of salt, considering the phalanx formation does cover some of the bases there. But obviously the lack of a shield is a problem. It means if enemy archers do start shooting into them, they're going to fall away pretty quickly. Even with the baseline unit having access to the 6 armour that these guys do, it's still nothing super high by any means. But also they're one of those entry-level units with long weapons where if the formation gets breached, they're in real trouble because the defensive skill is only 1, so pandemonium can break out pretty quickly. And this is combined with the fact that the Misty Mountains are more susceptible to morale breaks than basically any other faction in the game. So that is worth bearing in mind as you build your front line, but a cheap unit that can anchor some of your other basic units in place. But when it comes to a frontline fighting force, I think this is going to be the unit you're going to be depending on most of all as the Misty Mountains, and that is going to be the Moria Spear Guard. With a recruitment cost of 500, this is far more in line with what you would expect from some of the Kingdoms of Men, for example, and the other the other factions of orcs. But as you would expect from the Misty Mountains, they still maintain that very high numbers of 253. The obvious thing to speak about here is that they are spears, but not only that, an armour-piercing spear. So even though the attack is very low at 3, and they will of course be subject to the spear malus as well, the armour-piercing does mean that they are decently effective against certain types of units in melee as well. They have the shield wall, they have the bonus fighting cavalry, And the defensive scores are higher as well. I mean, the armour and the defensive skill is pretty much the same as the fully upgraded Goblin Infantry, but the shield value is significantly higher, and obviously the fact that they're spears as well means they can dig in just that little bit more easily. So you're going to see the Moria Spear Guard form the backbone of most of the Misty Mountains infantry forces that you see in the game, I would suggest, and for good reason, because they offer good value and they're a little bit more sturdy than the other goblins on the front line here, but they are more expensive as well, so that is worth bearing in mind. And finally, you may be surprised to see the Cave Troll Drummers way down here in the entry level, but they do only cost 200. There is a reason for that as well. It's the fact that they are pretty vulnerable. Among the trolls, they're by far the weakest combatants in melee. Most of this comes down to the fact they only have 4 hit points, and their other defensive abilities are extremely low in comparison to the other orcs. In particular, the armour is interesting. It means that this is probably the only type of troll unit where archers are actually going to be a genuine concern for them, because they're big targets and they don't really have much going for them defensively in that regard. They're quite similar to the Witchers, really, only again even bigger, so the archers are scarcely going to miss. They do still pack a decent punch at 12, but the main reason you would bring these guys is to be a morale battery, especially early on in fights when your goblins are going to be doing most of the heavy lifting in the first wave. You want them to last as long as possible before they break and flee. The Cave Troll Drummers will allow them to do that with a big radius on the morale boost that they do provide, and they can be used as emergency shock troops in the late game as well for only 200, so I feel like most of the time you're going to see the Cave Troll Drummers just to keep your more entry level units in check, but don't think that they're going to have the same level of effectiveness as other trolls. Far from it. They will fall away very, very fast. Now then, moving on to some of the more damage dealing units that you do have access to as the Misty Mountains, and we shall start off with the Heavy Swordsman that they have in their mid-tier, which is a nice thing for them to have. They share it with Canned among the evil factions, where they have a reasonably affordable Heavy Swordsman unit with high numbers, the Black Uruks of the mountains here, and those high numbers are the main selling point, really. 228 of these guys is a lot, and it's those numbers which do allow them to trade decently well with certain forces from other or certain units from other factions, I should say, and obviously the stats as well. When you compare them to the goblins just in front, an attack of 12 is a big step up. Not armor piercing, but because they are a heavy swordsman, they have a decent level of defensive skill, and I do say decent rather than good, because again those numbers are intended to be the real selling point more so than individual quality. Armor score again takes a bit of a step up here as well, so they may have a small shield value as a result of wearing their shields on their backs, but combined with the armor, the most basic of projectiles they can withstand a bit of, but for the most part I do feel as though these guys are going to be best served sort of in and amongst the rest of your units, providing that little bit more quality. 700 is obviously a step up, but like I said, the Misty Mountains can absorb costs of units more easily than most because of the options they have and their entry level. But if you do want an armor piercing option, you have the Mountain Orc Berserkers, which are very similar to units like the Black Wolds from Rudour or the Tribal Berserkers from the Rovanian, in the sense that they are that typical Berserker unit, armor piercing, locked morale, which does mean that they will continue fighting when other units flee, which can be very useful for the Misty Mountains, but it's not a fix-all really, because one of the problems that you will have with these guys is absolutely woeful defensive scores. You can see they've got big attack, even bigger than the Black Uruks of the mountains, combined with armor piercing, so from that point of view you would be like, well, why would you pick the Black Uruks? Well, one, these guys are more expensive at 800, there are significantly less of them at 158, and their defensive scores are terrible outside of the fact they have 2 hit points, so they're the quintessential Berserker really, in the sense that once that hit point is gone, they will fall away incredibly fast. 1 armor and 4 defensive skill for a unit that costs 800. So again, deploying them at the right time is important, but they do have a lot going for them, especially when you fold them into the rest of your roster in the ways that we've just mentioned. And then a very significant unit as well to place at the centre of your army, I find, going to be the White Uruk Fearmongers, a stronger unit of halberdiers than the Moria halberds just in front of them, albeit they do have some of the same traits, admittedly, in the sense that they are pretty reliant on their formation, even more so than most phalanx units, to be really effective. They do inspire nearby troops, which is very, very nice. It's another way that you can inspire your troops other than just the Cave Troll Drummers and your bodyguard units, and these guys are going to be in the thick of things for the most part anyway. Obviously the phalanx, bonus fighting cavalry, effectiveness against armour, the ability to cause fear as well is nice. I mean, it is a tool that the Misty Mountains can wield between these guys and their monstrous units. They do have options there, so they're not the only ones that are going to be on the receiving end of a bit of psychological warfare. Good stats, better stats certainly, the attack of 13. They've also got better armour. I mean, among regular units that's very fine. 950 is a lot, however, for a unit such as this. I mean, they do fill the same sort of role as something like the Wardens of Tir Gorthad or the Illuminous Gate Guards from the Arnorian factions, and they cost, you know, in the same sort of ballpark as well, so you'd expect a good job from them. But the main issue here again is going to be the defensive skill. I mean, it's not on the floor like it is with the Moria Halberds, but if their formation does get breached, they are in trouble, and they can't fend for themselves in quite the same way as some other higher level halberdiers can a little bit more. But when it comes to bodyguard units, the Misty Mountains are also pretty well stocked. Well, bodyguards and monstrous infantry, we'll call it. The most sort of safe place to put your general, I would suggest, in terms of infantry units, going to be the Goblin Kingsguard. Relatively basic in terms of what this sort of unit can offer. They do inspire nearby troops as well. Always nice to have when you're a faction which can be a bit flimsy morale-wise, and none more so than the Misty Mountains, of course. When it comes to, I mean, 83 is, you know, the most that a bodyguard unit is ever likely to have, so again, dipping into the numbers, and also dipping into the fact that it's relatively low cost for this sort of unit. Only 1,000 for a bodyguard tier unit is very nice. Obviously the stats do dip below what some other factions have, but not by as much as maybe you would expect. An attack of 16 is still perfectly serviceable for a unit of sword and board infantry, and then you also have decent defensive abilities as well. The armour is maybe not as high as some others, but the defensive skill is still good. Shield again, just a little bit lower, but still have that second hit point. And there are reasons why you would probably want to put your general in this unit, because they don't have the hide anywhere trait, like the other units of bodyguard infantry that the Misty Mountains have, that being the Blackback Mountain Berserkers, because if you put the general in it, they do lose the ability to hide anywhere, which is significant, because when it comes to what they do well, obviously as an armour-piercing shock troop, they're going to be very good when they're taking the front foot. An attack of 18, which is armour-piercing. They cause fear as well, which is not beyond the pale for this kind of unit from the Orcish factions. The charge bonus is a little lower, but again, they wield 2 individual weapons rather than 1 big weapon, so that's kind of the trade-off there. But they do gain defensively, because that's a big defensive skill score of 24. When you combine that with the 2 hit points, they can be a surprisingly tough nut to crack, really, among the Misty Mountains units. The armour score is serviceable, but no shield. Does mean that arrows and other such ranged projectiles are going to be the main bane for this kind of unit. Again, the armour is fine. 1200 is also not the most expensive for this kind of unit, but still, you do want to look after them, and that does mean you want to maintain the ability to hide anywhere if you can. Because I feel like some people don't even realise what they're losing when they put the general in this unit, and then it can't hide anywhere at all. And this is one of the main units which enemies will be looking to try and single out if they can. So do bear that in mind, because if you do get them into melee without any sort of ranged interference, they can be very, very potent indeed. Speaking of which, something else that the Misty Mountains can call upon is 2 units of trolls, albeit the cave trolls are a little bit different to all of the ones that we've seen up until this point, because again, they focus on numbers, being slightly cheaper, but individual quality not quite up to the same sort of level. 6 hit points. The main thing here is the armour score being only 2 is significantly lower than the heavier trolls we've seen from other factions. But again, there are 40 of them. They are pretty much the purest example of a shock unit that the game has to offer, because they can plough through lines and cause real chaos in behind them. And while they are a bit of a flash in the pan and they will fall away faster than other combat trolls, this does give your main army the time it needs to really take advantage of the holes that you can create. And they don't have a great shield infantry unit, the Misty Mountains, but the cave trolls kind of fill a similar sort of role. The snow trolls here, who also can hide anywhere, it's crouching down, I mean, stealthy as they are here on the grassy plain, but they're a little bit stronger in melee terms. They've got a bit better armour, their stats in general are a bit better. The fact they can hide anywhere is also nice. Effectiveness against armour and fear is not too strange for trolls either, a little bit more expensive. Still only the same level of hit points, so they don't have quite the same heft as some of the trolls from other factions, but there are again more of them. Only 30 instead of 40, but that's still a significant increase in comparison to the heavy trolls from other factions. Something else, which isn't immediately apparent here, is the snow trolls also cover ground very quickly, so they can catch cavalry out, although one thing that you have to be careful of there is if cavalry gets a good charge on trolls, they'll do a lot of damage very, very quickly. Now, the inverse is also true, so it's a bit of a game of cat and mouse. But the fact that they can move more quickly means you're more likely to be able to catch cavalry out, so that's a potential avenue for really good value to be made. Now then, the Misty Mountains do have all of their bases covered when it comes to ranged units, albeit these two are the wrong way around, typically enough. But we will start off with the Javelins, the Snaga Skirmishers, because we have seen these guys before, marching under Isengard's banner, and they're exactly the same here. Obviously pretty woeful in melee. I mean, kind of similar in terms of their performance to standard Goblin infantry before their armour has been upgraded, but still worse than that. Obviously 400, but cheap and cheerful javelins, and just look at the smiles on those Snargers' faces in that image, having a great time. And cheap javelins are going to be a real boon for you, especially in a siege battle, because it's really difficult for the enemy to avoid you getting a lot of value with them. Whether that's them dying in, absorbing the enemy's resources, or whether that's them getting a good amount of damage for such a cheap unit. It's a bit of a puzzle for enemies to figure out how best to deal with them, because it may only be a missile attack of 5 that's relatively close range, but it's armor piercing, it's dangerous, it has to be dealt with, and there are 200 of them, so 200 javelins heading towards your lines is not something that you want to see too much of. Now then, the upgraded Goblin archers, as we see them over here, the unupgraded version being in that image there. Once again, the sort of tatty Balrog inspired armour, albeit they lack the helm, which is part of the reason why their armour score is only 5 rather than 6. And the numbers and the relatively cheap cost is where the good things really begin and end about the Goblin archers. They're not a particularly long-range skirmish-centric faction, the Misty Mountains, and this is their only option when it comes to doing that. Trying to go for numbers, just trying to contest that particular back and forth. And yeah, I think that obviously the melee score is very, very low as well. Only 3. Missile attack of 4 is lower than even the lowliest of human archers as well. And when it comes to their defensive stats also, that armour is enough to be a pain potentially, but not going to be enough to really win any skirmishing fights. So it's all about just contesting it. You don't want to place too much stock into this unit winning you a battle, but you can make the life awkward for the opposition, and that's the main point. Something which will be of greater concern to your opposition, however, going to be these guys. You've got the heavy Goblin crossbows, which, they're not the weakest baseline crossbows in terms of their own survivability in the game, but they do come pretty close. But you pay 700 and you get a unit which is not a fully glass cannon, but you do still need to protect them at least a little bit. 700 cost, and the missile attack of 10, good stopping power on them. The defensive ability, again, 6 is 1 armor level higher. In melee, again, they're pretty woeful, and like with the Goblin archers, it's going to be sort of a last-ditch effort when you send these guys in to try and have them win any sort of battle in melee for you. But the crossbows in a siege, or on the open field really, because of the Misty Mountains' lack of options elsewhere, are going to be an ever-present because of the damage they can lay down in a short period of time. Cavalry-wise, at least initially, it's pretty much by the book for the Misty Mountains. We start off with the standard Warg Riders. Same sort of thing applies here to the ones that we've seen before. Effectiveness against armour, kind of like Berserkers on horseback in the sense they do have that second hit point for a relatively cheap unit, but the rest of the stats, certainly defensively, are pretty lackluster, and they're more designed to make life difficult for enemy cavalry units than anything else. Their charge bonus is relatively meagre. They do scare horses as well, so they are a pretty focused unit in that regard. And then for only a little bit more, you do get the javelin throwing variant, which can be utilised in sieges a little bit more easily. Only 25 gold more, and you get a missile attack with 8 armor piercing attack from range. A little bit more micro-intensive perhaps, and in terms of melee, they are still a little bit weaker, but it's just whether or not you can get that value with those javelins. A little bit more of a, they can be more effective across a wider variety of maps, I think, but still, you can go a little bit more Warg heavy if you want and make life more difficult for opposition cavalry, because after all, cavalry can cause havoc among your regular goblins if you leave them completely undefended from lacking units like this. So you do need to bear that in mind. Then, kind of a weird unit really. They do technically count as cavalry, but they're kind of like a cavalry, or like regular cavalry chariot hybrid. The Drake Broodlings, costing 1300, kind of like living battering rams in a way. They, along with the cave trolls, are one of the main issues that oppositions will have in terms of defending against you. If they want to keep solid lines, then the Drake Broodlings and the cave trolls together can really cause them problems. The issue is, of course, that's quite a lot of money for yourself, so if they don't work out, you can find yourself financially in the hole, even as the Misty Mountains, and that can be a difficult thing to come back from. And the Drake Broodlings are a difficult unit to use in a really effective manner. There may be 60 of them, but because they are cavalry, they do take anti-cavalry damage, and stuff like pikes can devastate them. And ultimately, if you don't keep them moving, even in melee against infantry, they can fall away pretty quickly, because they only have 3 hit points and terrible defensive stats outside of that. So if you keep them moving, they can be devastating. If you allow them to stop, or they get caught by anti-cav, or by other cavalry to be fair, they can be in real trouble. Something a little bit more by the book, however, we have the Bolg champions, albeit they may be a little bit more similar to some of the kingdoms of men that surround them and some of the elves in terms of what their focus is, because they're a little bit more anti-infantry focused than some of the best bodyguard cavalry from other orcish factions, in the sense they have that big 20 charge bonus and they have long weaponry as their choice rather than a melee weapon. The defensive scores are also pretty damn good in terms of decent armor, good defensive skill to help get them out of a jam, that second hit point, and 1400, which is not the most expensive for a cavalry unit, but then they do have some shortcomings here and there, given the fact that they don't have a dedicated anti-cavalry bonus, but they do scare horses, which is nice, and they do have that anti-infantry capability, which the other wargs do lack, and the other orcish factions kind of lack this kind of unit. And it is also a safe place to put your general, and maintaining your general's life is important as the Misty Mountains, more so than maybe any other faction in the game, to try and top that morale off. So putting him on a mount means that you can get him out of harm's way just that little bit more easily. And finally, the unique artillery piece. I mean, you're always rolling the dice a little bit when it comes to artillery, and perhaps that is most true of all with the Goblin War Engine, also known as the Orc Mangonel, because it has that Roman candle-esque projectile, which you're never really sure what it's going to do. It could be devastating to the enemy, it could completely miss, or it could also hit your own men that are fighting nearby, and considering the huge morale-sapping capabilities of it, that can be a real problem for the Misty Mountains, because they're perhaps the most susceptible to their own artillery pieces' devastating effects. So it can be a bit of a catch-22. You always, again, like I said, are at risk when you use artillery. But I think certainly in most siege battles it's definitely going to be worthwhile bringing, because the devastation it can bring is significant. You can cause enemy units to flee, chaos can take hold, and then that's when your numbers of goblins can really be at their most effective. 900 is also pretty reasonable for an artillery piece, albeit all of the work really is going to be on the artillery itself to get the value, because the crew is standard goblin infantry, and unlike with most others where you can put a little bit of the emphasis on the crew to get some work done as well, that is not going to be true of standard goblin infantry unupgraded as they are. So do bear that in mind. Can be a risk, but the reward can potentially be pretty great, because again, seizing the momentum is all important as an orcish faction, and leveraging your numbers as the Misty Mountains arguably more so than any other. So there we are. We have the Misty Mountains in all their festering glory here. The final orcish faction that we will be talking about in the game, at least for the time being. At some point in the future, Dol Guldur will make their appearance, but until then, all of the orcish factions have been showcased now. And we will be moving on next to the final Dwarven faction. And it's pretty appropriate, because squatting in Moria, as the goblins here are, the dwarves will be wanting to reclaim it and give it back its old title. So next time we will be looking at the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.